Welcome to the Holiness Today podcast. On this Archives episode, listen to Neil Wiseman and Carl Bangs discuss the early ministry of Phineas Bresee in Iowa. This audio was originally recorded for the Ministers Tape Club in September of 1979.
Now let me share an intriguing conversation I had with Carl Bangs regarding Dr. Bresee's early ministry in Iowa. The research for this conversation was done for the Wiley Lecture Series at Point Loma College last year. Dr. Bangs has taught for 18 years here in Kansas City at the St. Paul's School of Theology. He is a professor of historical theology there and a world authority on Arminius. Nice to have you here in the studio with us today, Carl. Tell me, how did you happen to begin your study on Bresee, and particularly the Iowa part of his ministry?
Well, as you know, a great deal of my research has been done in 16th century Holland, so it was something of a jump to do research in 19th century Iowa. The situation was this, that I was being asked to give the opening convocation address on the 75th anniversary year of Point Loma College, from which I graduated some years ago, and it occurred to me that it would be useful to try to understand something about the founder of the college, Dr. Bresee, also a principal founder of the Church of the Nazarene.
Where did you go about finding material to research this subject?
Well, I was rather presumptuous. I promised Point Loma that I would give a paper on Bresee before I had even tried to do any research. But I knew Methodism well enough to know that they keep records on everything, and I would probably find a great deal of material in Iowa. That proved to be the case. I worked in the denominational archives in Des Moines and also in the state archives, and there I found material that had not been used before in studies of Bresee.
Let's see, about what was Bresee's age when he went to California from his Iowa ministry?
Well, Dr. Bresee was born in upstate New York in 1838. He'd gone to Iowa in 1857, so he was just a very young person, 19 years old when he began his ministry. He started preaching immediately in Iowa. He left Iowa in 1883. In the late summer, he would have been 45 the next December, so he was 44 years old when he went to California.
What was his ministry like in Iowa?
It was a very typical ministry of a preacher on the frontier at a time when the state was just opening up. There was not yet a good road across Iowa. The railroads were just coming in. He began on a circuit as the junior assistant to an older man who rode a circuit, the Marengo circuit. He moved at least every 2 years for the most part. It was then the rule in Methodism that a minister moved every 2 years. During the time that he was in Iowa, the rule was changed to 3 years. In fact, during the 26 years that he served in the Methodist Episcopal Church in Iowa, he had 13 appointments. And they began with very hard scrabble circuits. In one case, he was even demoted to a place that was much worse than he'd been before. At the same time, early in his career, he was made a presiding elder, later called a district superintendent, when he was only 25 years old, a very young person to have such an appointment. He did not like administration. He wanted to be a pastor, so he stayed in the presiding eldership only 1 year and went back to the pastorate. But it averaged out to about 2 years per appointment for 26 years in Iowa.
Was his involvement in the pastorate a people kind of relationship, or was he strong on preaching, or how did he go about doing his ministry?
I would say that one thing to say about his ministry is that he pursued it with vigor. He had asked the bishop for a change in appointment at one time because he was not getting along well with a congregation of Southerners. Bresee was an ardent Northerner, going into Iowa just on the eve of the Civil War, being very much pro-North and anti-slavery. He had a congregation of transplanted Southerners. They did not agree with each other on that issue. He asked to be moved, and the bishop moved him down. On that downward move, he had the tag ends of some other circuits that had been lopped off. They were all the small places. Bresee was quite dismayed, but he decided to go at it and work hard, and by the time another annual conference came around, that circuit had grown. He had had an increase in salary. He had been able to buy a new buggy and a team of horses, and as I have said, with a certain semi-satisfied, you might say a semi-sanctified satisfaction, he showed up at annual conference having prevailed. In every place, he worked very hard with people. At Red Oak, where he was notably successful in effecting growth in the congregation and building a big building, he called on people individually to be converted. He gained his members by conversion, many times by the conversion of adults in the community. He was very forthright about evangelism. Evangelism was the work of the pastor. His churches then grew in spirituality, in membership, in finances, so that in almost every place he went, he showed remarkable growth. I would say, yes, it was a people-oriented ministry. He worked directly with people in their homes, in their offices, in their stores, and also in the church, where he would talk to people individually in the services about being a Christian.
We'll be right back with the rest of this episode. But did you know you can receive credit for listening to Holiness Today podcast? Holiness Today podcast episodes qualify for lifelong learning with the Church of the Nazarene. To register for lifelong learning, simply go to learning.nazarene.org. The Lifelong Learning Registry provides Nazarene ministers the opportunity to record and report their efforts to develop and maintain a pattern of lifelong learning to enhance the ministry to which God has called them. Every Nazarene minister is encouraged to engage in a variety of lifelong learning activities. The code for Holiness Today podcast is 64627 and will also be listed in the show notes. This code can be utilized for this episode and any previous episode you wish to listen to. Thank you for being a listener and sharing in the ministry of the Church of the Nazarene. Now back to the rest of your episode.
What are the dimensions or the ingredients that went into making him a leader?
It's hard to say. Of course, he died before I was born, but my parents knew him well. He evidently was a very attractive person. He was dignified. He was extremely able. Although he had no opportunity for formal higher education, he was a constant reader. He was very much aware of what was going on in the world. He was an informed person, evidently an eloquent preacher, and a man with executive ability. I think that he was a person with presence. If you look at his pictures in his older age, he appears as the leader. You can see it. I have a picture of him in a district assembly in the old Northwest District in Seattle in about 1914, somewhere in there, shortly before he died. And there he is as an imposing presence, not domineering, but one who attracted people to him. I have heard eyewitness reports of how he presided, for instance, in district assemblies, and he was able very often to bring order out of chaos. He was a master of parliamentary procedure. In fact, when he was still a young man in Iowa, on 2 occasions, when the bishop could not be present in annual conference, it was Bresee who presided at annual conference, and in Methodism that was a very great honor and very rare. I have every confidence that had he remained in Iowa as a Methodist minister, he would have become a bishop.
Do you find anything in Bresee's Iowa ministry as either a taproot or an antecedent, perhaps, of his great interest in education? Or is his interest in education something that we just rather impose on him as we look back on his work?
No, he was extremely interested in higher education. In almost every year, during the later years, after his very early years as a teenager and early 20s, but as soon as he became a presiding elder, and I would say then for 20 years, he was usually a conference visitor to one of the educational institutions. There were several colleges in Iowa, some of which still survive and others disappeared. He was either a conference visitor to the college or a member of its trustees, and then he was also a conference visitor on several occasions to Garrett Biblical Institute in Chicago, which was the primary source of the training of ministers for that area.
Excuse me, I don't think I know what a conference visitor is.
Well, a conference visitor was somebody who represented the annual conference to the institution, made a visit to the conference. There would be several to each school, and would report back to the next annual conference on the conditions and needs of the institution in question. The Methodist Church was in the forefront of establishing educational institutions as it moved across the plains. Bresee's closest ties were to the school of his own conference, which called the Indianola Male and Female Academy. Indianola is about 20 miles south of Des Moines. It had been founded in 1860. It had had an unclear purpose. In 1866, the conference selected Bresee to be the chairman of a committee to study the Indianola Male and Female Academy and decide what should be done with it. In 1867, he brought back a report that the only way to go was to develop a 4-year college and give it the full support of the conference. He worked up new articles of incorporation. These were presented to the conference and adopted, and they established a full-fledged college to be known as Simpson Centenary College, named for his, you might say, his ideal bishop, Bishop Matthew Simpson, and the word centenary had to do with the celebration of American Methodism's centennial. The report was adopted, and Bresee was elected to the first Board of Trustees, where he served for the remaining 16 years of his Iowa ministry. I got very interested in Indianola College because of Bresee's involvement in it, and I discovered that it was he who raised a lot of the money that enabled the college to assume its new 4-year status. He took on the task of raising money for erecting College Hall. College Hall is still one of the finest buildings on the Simpson campus. He conceived the college to be a place of what he liked to call Christian culture, and in one of his reports to the conference, he reported, and I'm going to read from his report, from the conference minutes. He said, "Above all, the religious life of the college, the baptism of the Holy Spirit so richly shed upon the faculty and students, evidenced by the fact that over 95% of the students profess our holy religion, and are not only zealous in their studies, but are also devout and attentive to religious duties, is an insurance of the divine favor upon the institution. Too many institutions of learning," he said, "especially those outside church control, aim chiefly to educate the mind, almost entirely ignoring the higher and more important education, that of the heart. Simpson Centenary College is a religious institution of learning." And I found this fascinating because he really was the principal founder of that college, had that experience behind him when later on he organized Dietz Pacific Bible College, which became Nazarene University, which became Pasadena College, which became Point Loma College, something over 3/4 of a century ago. He was already experienced in the organization of a college.
How do you account for the idea that a man who was largely self-educated should be so committed to higher education?
Bresee was self-educated out of necessity, as with so many people on the frontier. He was relatively poor. He did not have access to college education himself. He did not regard that as a virtue, but rather as a problem to be overcome. And in view of that, he was constantly reading the best literature, both religious and secular. If you look at his library and the quotations in his sermons, you will see that he had a very well-furnished mind. He had a zeal for learning, which I think is central to understanding him.
So our great emphasis in the denomination on higher education is really quite in keeping with the concept of church and college being married that Bresee had in his mind. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so. And I think that he had this understanding perhaps even more clearly than many Methodists who were supporting colleges half-heartedly and then tending to turn them loose. He wanted it to be a religious institution of learning.
Well, perhaps our subscribers and listeners are most interested in my next question. What did you learn about his understanding of pastoral ministry? Did Bresee have pastoral instincts? How did he go about his pastoral work, and what was his vision of the local church?
One of the exciting discoveries that I made in Iowa was a paper that he read at a convention in 1881 on the topic of the pastoral ministry. And I'd like to read you some pieces out of that paper because I believe that will answer your question. He said that the work of the pastor embraces all departments of Christian ministry. The pastor is first of all an evangelist. He said he must work in that large borderland where the church and the world meet and mingle, where those who are not Christians, yet permeated largely with Christian thought and Christian principles, sit in our sanctuaries and abide in our homes. And when just outside of this circle, there are large numbers almost under the shadow of our church who are devoid of all Christian life. And it was there on the edges, you might say, of the church that the pastor has his first responsibility. And he said it would be a poor ministry that is not an evangel to the unsaved. His phrase was, that gathered no souls to the crop. The pastor was his own evangelist for Bresee. There was a controversy at the time about independent evangelists floating around under no ecclesiastical authority or discipline. Bresee felt for a matter of order and also for a matter of spiritual effectiveness that evangelism is the pastor's own responsibility and his first responsibility. Bresee had a broader view of the pastorate than that, however, because he said the pastor is also a teacher. The church is, in fact, a school. He said that if it is fully equipped and organized, it is indeed a university with the pastor for a president. The pastor occupies the office of teacher of the word of truth to the whole church, a calling which is his because he is a seer. His gaze, Bresee said, is further in the azure and deeper into the depths of truth, especially such truths as pertain to our redemption, salvation, and perfection of the souls of men. And truth for Bresee was not small, static, or manageable. It was large and alive. He said, everywhere there are unexplored depths, and it is only as we gaze into these depths and come with the sense of their infinite glory fresh upon us that we can teach them efficiently to others. The evangelistic and teaching functions of the pastor find their unity and force in what Bresee called a moral power, which makes the pastor's own unseen life draw men and compel them towards Christ and heaven. I like this sentence. A man who, seeing truth, is not thrilled by it, to whose cheek it brings no glow, is not fitted to be a Christian teacher.
That's a magnificent statement. So for Bresee, there was really nothing contradictory between education and evangelism, then, was there?
Not at all. The two functions were to be united in the very work of the pastor and in the life of the local church. He wanted pastors who were what he called large souls. Large enough, he said, to take into his heart all classes of men, whatever their relation to him. And he stands especially near to the poor and despised. And then he had a bit of admonition to those who thought they might want to be ministers. He said, if there be those here who find it possible that they have a call to the ministry, let them pay attention. The ministry is not a work of convenience, to be taken up and laid down as we may or may not have other work to do. It is no special sign that a man is called to the Christian pastorate because he has nothing to do or has failed in other things. A true condition of this work can only be drawn from the work of the Son of God. We must stand in the shadow of the cross, and as we gaze upon that dying Christ and see the glory of the love of God in that marred face, waiting here, the true pastor learns the value of men and feels that 'tis all my business here below to cry, behold the Lamb.
For more information about Dr. Bresee's early ministry, you may want to read Dr. Bang's article in the September-November issue of the Preacher's Magazine.
Thank you for listening to the Holiness Today podcast. If you enjoyed this production and wish to hear more, visit holinesstoday.org/podcast or find us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts.